Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about the flashcard program. Now remember, the goal with this is to create a piece of software that essentially will allow a user to help study for an exam, particularly exams that involve factual knowledge, so definitions of words, for example. Now, what is it that we have to do to implement this? Well, we're going to want to use lists to store the words and the definitions. So remember how this software is supposed to work. So it's supposed to ask the user for a number of flashcards to create, and then for each one it should ask for the word and the definition for that card. After the program has asked for the correct number of information about what should the program be quizzing the user on, the next step is to actually start the studying process. So the program basically should show the user one of the words randomly selected or pseudo-randomly selected using the random module, and then wait for the user to press enter before actually showing what the correct definition is. And so the user could think, and then once he thinks he has the right solution, right, you go and you press enter and you get that. And then when you're ready for the next word, you press enter again, and it shows the next randomly chosen word. And this cycle can basically continue, pick random word, pick a random word, pick a random word, until the user's done studying and he closes out the program or something, right? So we need to figure out how to implement this, and one of the things we're going to use is lists. In particular, we are going to want to use lists for storing the words and the definitions, and then we will use the random module to pick a random index into the words list when we're trying to select a random word to show the user. So this is the outline that I want you to follow for implementing this code. So we're going to want to have the main function, of course, but also three others, and it's important when you're building a program to make sure you split up your program into different subtasks. Each function should have a very particular task, and don't try to have one function do too many different things. Keep each function nice and concise. And of course, we're also going to want the random module, so there's that line up at the top. But let's go in to look at what these functions should be. And I'm actually going to just show you main, so you can go ahead and kind of look at this to figure out, to kind of see, well, this function is going to make calls to two of the other functions, function defs that I am going to ask you to pick the right one of. So we have a words and a definition list that we're going to start out as empty, but then we're going to ask the user, hey, tell me how many flashcards you want to create. And for each of those flashcards, we're going to call the, for each of the flashcards, we want to call the getCard function. And basically what this is going to do is we're going to pass in the words and the definitions list, because we're going to want to append the flashcard to that, and the index. But then that function, one of its jobs is basically going to be, or its job is going to be to ask the user for a word, ask the user for a definition, and then put that word and definition into the correct lists. And then after we've gotten all the flashcard information, we then want to go through and just kind of in an infinite loop keep quizzing the user, quizzing the user, quizzing the user. A feature that you could think, oh, maybe it'd be cool if we added something where, let's say the user types in a certain input, like if you type in exit, maybe that stops the program. But for now, we'll just, for this video, we'll just implement it where it'll just keep looping and keep asking the user for input until the user just decides to stop the code. So what I want you to think about is how would we implement this getCard function? So read the comment there to determine what it's supposed to do. But basically, we want this function to ask the user for the two inputs, a word and its corresponding definition, and then it should append those to the word and definition lists accordingly. And we're going to want to put those in there so that later, when we're actually quizzing the user, we have the data that we can recall. So how do we do this? What do you think would be a good implementation? All right, well, as usual with computer science, there's more than one way to solve a problem, but this is one way that we can do it. So the getCard function, just getting an input, right? That should be something we're familiar with. We put the card number in there, so that way it can actually print out, what's your word for card number 1, card number 2, and so on. And then once we have that, it's just a matter of appending, right? And we're going to append, but here is something key to keep in mind about how this is structured. So let's say for the first, when this program is running, right, let's say we want 2 input cards for this program. Well, let's just say the first, word is, ant, and the next word is zebra. All right. So if we have those as the 2 input words, and then the definition of ant, I'll say is like an insect, and then I'll say this is a striped animal. Not very specific definitions, but just for the purposes of example. So when this function gets called first, what it will do is it will append ant into, let's say, the words list. Let's say this is the words list, and the definitions list is this. So it will append ant into that list, and it will append an insect into the definitions list. And then when this function gets called again for the second flashcard, we would append zebra in there, and we would then append a striped animal into the other one. So notice what's happening with the indexes. Every time I get a new flashcard, I put a string in each one of these lists, but the definition goes at the same index as the word did in the other list. So if I am looking at, let's say, the word zebra at index 1, if I want to know what's the definition for zebra, I go and look at index 1 in the definitions list. And if we were to add a third element over here, let's say we added, elephant, and some definition for elephant, then we would be able to, match, okay, if elephant's at index 2, then we find the definition for it at index 2. So you can basically do this kind of mapping between these 2 lists, and that's important to maintain as we're adding new words. So we have main and we have get card, and so basically if we ran this program at this point, we would still want to bring it over to mu. We should at least be able to, test the part where we give it the information about the flashcards. So I could say, what were my 2 examples? Ant and an insect, and zebra, a striped animal. Okay, so we eventually reached an error, and that's because my quiz function is not yet defined in mu right now, but the first part of it at least worked. So it's good to kind of test your programs incrementally rather than just waiting till the end to see if the whole thing works. So we got that. Now on to the next step. So print card. I actually want you to figure out how this function should be implemented. So the whole goal of it is it's going to take some content and it's basically going to format it. Of course, it doesn't really look like a card, but we're basically just putting a little box around text so that we can print out words with a box and we can print out definitions with a box. So how would we write this function to take in some content text and then print it out formatted in a nice, neat box? So again, multiple ways to do this, but one simple way using string multiplication is like so. If you figure out the length of your content, just using the length function, how long is that string, you can print that content out in this middle print with a little bit of spacing and then the bars on each side. But then to figure out how many dashes to put above and below, you can have a few on the sides, but then of course you just multiply a dash by your length. And this will put text into a nice, neat box when we go to actually start printing these out. So the function that's going to call this other function, the function that's going to call print card, is quiz. So this is actually going to, like it says, its job is to select a random word from the data that we have, and it has 2 parameters which you can expect are the words list and the definitions list created previously. And after you've picked a random index, you should print out that word in a box and then wait for the user to press enter. and then print out the definition after the user presses enter, and so on. So essentially, this is kind of one round of quizzing for preparing for an exam. So how do we do this? And particularly, you should use the random module to get this done. So how can we implement this? Here is one way of multiple ways to do it. So if we want to get a random word from the words list, right? Let's say there's let's just use numbers. Let's say, or actually, sorry, let me talk it through first, and then we can run it in a little bit. So if we want to get a random word, we want to generate a random index in our list, right? So whether we have 5 words or 5,000 words, we want us to support picking a random word in that data set. So for our random integer that we want to generate, we want it to be between our range of indexes, which of course would start at 0, and would be the last index would be whatever the length of our list is minus 1. So we pick a random index, and then to get the word at that index, we do this. But again, because we built our lists carefully, where the definition for a word is at the matching index in the 2 lists, to get the definition, we also just use that same index and look it up in the definitions list. Now, we could just print out the word and print out the definition, but we want to be a little bit smarter about it, right? We want to print out the card where it has the nice box. But then the problem with the way I've implemented this on the slide is there's no pause in between printing out the word and the definition. Like I said before, we want it to kind of pause, wait for the user to press enter so we don't just give away the answer. So the way that we can do that, if you just write the input command and you don't even have to say, something equals input, you just write input and say press enter to continue, that will kind of force a pause in the program. User can think about it. When he's ready, you press enter, right? And then it will go on to the next part. So this should be a correct implementation. Get a random index, we get the word and the definition, and then we do the quizzing component. So now we're at the point where we have all 4 of the functions implemented. So let's go test this out, and we'll use the same example actually from the slide, one of the earlier ones where we had like faith and hope and some other word. So we got the code. Let's actually make the mu window a little bigger. And let's go to this example. So we'll do grace, faith, and peace. That's my example that I put in. So we will run this. Go back to mu. And we want to create 3 flashcards. So I'll say grace, and I'll just do copy paste for these definitions. So that's the definition, and then faith, and definition, and peace. Definition. All right. So after it finished, it went right into quizzing mode. So it chose peace as the first word. So it doesn't just go through them in the same order you gave it. So peace was the 3rd word, but that's the one, the random number it picked for the index must have been 2. So you can sit there and think about, what's the correct answer, and hit enter, and then it reveals that answer to you. And then when you're ready to move on to the next word, hit enter again, and then it chose grace, which was the first one. Think about it, press enter, think about it, and it actually selected grace again. So it is pseudo-random, so it's possible, especially if you don't have very many cards, that you get the same card twice in a row. And press enter, peace, grace, when is it going to do faith? Wow, there we go, faith. So, and then it does that. So basically this is just running through and pausing in this while true loop. So when you're done studying for the test, you would just, in this case, just hit the stop button when you're done. So we've implemented it, right? Now there's a couple of weaknesses, or one big glaring weakness stylistically to this code, which is a lack of comments. So how could we add some comments to this? Well, we're not required to do it for main, but let's come up with at least 1 or 2 comments. So this function is pretty easy. I could say, this function's job is to print out text formatted in a box. And then, of course, you always want to make sure you document what your parameters are. So I would say content, a string to print out in the box. Now, it's a fairly simple function, so you might think, oh, that's kind of overkill. Why am I adding this comment to this function? But it's good practice, even though even I myself, right, there's been plenty of times where I've written functions and not put comments on them. But it's good to get into that habit to make sure you're documenting clearly what your functions are doing. So for this quiz one, a slightly more involved function, what can we say for this one? So this function is supposed to quiz the user for a random word in the data set. It picks a random word plus definition, shows the word to the user, and then waits, let's do a line break, waits for the user to press enter to show the definition. Right, so that may not be a perfect description, but we want to describe what it does. And then we say words, a list of strings, a list of the words of the cards. And then we can kind of say something similar about definitions, right? A list of the definitions. Now, some of this commenting, right, I'm just kind of doing this live. I'm coming up with these comments. These may not be the perfect way to comment this code, but I'm just kind of trying to give you an idea about when you write functions, particularly for this class, make sure you're coming up with documentation. And it doesn't even have to be like, it's better if it can be really, really good, but it doesn't have to be like super deeply thought out comments. Sometimes it's just a matter of quickly getting your ideas out in the comments so that you don't forget what the function's for and what each parameter is for. So for the get card one, this one's also a pretty easy function, a pretty simple function. This function gets a word and definition from the user and adds it to the data. And then we could say words, the list of words to add to, because a part of this function is supposed to add to the words, right? Definitions, the list of definitions to add to, and then card num is integer representing the card we are asking for. So what number card, basically. So there we go, right? Basically, I kind of want to show, first of all, remind you it's important to add comments, but also show you that it doesn't have to be like a gigantic chore adding comments. Of course, we could have done these in more depth, but in a matter of just a few minutes, I was able to come up with some, decent commenting for this code. So it's something that you can also do. Remember how back in the slides, when I showed you the outline for the code, I showed you this. So something that you can do when you're working on a program is maybe I'm probably going to need a function that does X, right? It's going to have such and such particular job, and it's probably going to need these parameters, but maybe you just don't feel like implementing it right now, right? Maybe you want to wait on implementing it. One thing you can do is you could go ahead and create the function definition, and you could write a couple of notes to yourself in the comments saying, get back to this function eventually. It's supposed to do X and Y and Z, and it's supposed to return this, but I'm going to implement it later. And then you can just kind of leave that there, and then when you're going through your code, hopefully you'll see that and be like, oh yeah, I still need to go finish implementing this function, right? So anyway, hopefully that example helped. First of all, gave you an example of using lists in a program, but also hopefully it helps you continue to think about how do I structure my programs, how do I design the code so that it's organized into functions, so that each function has a very distinct job, and so that basically you learn to have good coding structure when you're writing code. So I will talk to you in the next video. Have a good one, everybody.